So hi everyone, let's now talk about your juvenile delinquency. Take note, in the board examination, hindi sumasabit ang examinee dahil hindi niya alam yung sagot. Nagkataon lang na alam niya sana, but he was not able to understand the question. And take note, the key to understanding the question is for you to understand the terminologies used in said question. Okay? By the way, our discussion would be in English, but you also expect na I would be speaking in Tagalog for purposes of better understanding. So to start with, puntahan natin yung different terminologies ninyo. First term that you need to remember is the word child. Now, universally speaking, whenever you talk about a child is any person under 18 years old. I repeat, universally speaking, a child is any person under 18 years old. Meaning, you haven't reached 18 yet. Wala ka pang 18. So hanggat wala ka pang 18, universally speaking, you are still considered as a child. Okay? Ma'am, ba't ganun? Kasi nga, universally speaking, majority of the countries would tell you that 18 is the age of emancipation or the age of majority. Ibig sabihin yan, the moment you strike 18, you are no longer a child but rather you are now considered as an adult. Ibig sabihin, everything you do would now produce legal effects. Why? Kasi nga 18 is the age of emancipation. It is the age of majority. Meaning, the moment you strike 18, you are already an adult. So for you to be considered as a child, universally speaking, dapat wala ka pang 18. Okay? Pero take note, that's the universal definition. In some countries, childhood would be as late as 25 years old. Ibig sabihin, although universally, a child is any person under 18 years old, there are certain countries whereby childhood would be as late as 25. Ibig sabihin, there are countries na kino-consider kanila as a child even if you are already 18 and above, provided hindi ka pa lumalampas sa 25. Ma'am, bakit ganon? Kasi nga, the definition of a child would be dependent on the law governing the country using the term. So example, in the Philippines, we have a law defining who a child is. Okay? So para makita natin who is a child under Philippine laws, tignan natin ngayon yung definition na provided ng law natin. So take note, because we are talking about a Philippine law, let's use the term Filipino child. Okay? Para clear tayo. Take note, a Filipino child has two definitions under Philippine laws. Yung number 1, sabi niya, a Filipino child is any person under 18 years old. So a Filipino child is any person under 18 years old. If you are going to look at this definition, walang problema. Because this definition complies with the universal definition of who a child is. So any person under 18 years old. Yun nga lang, under Philippine laws, in-extend ngayon yung definition ng Filipino child. Kaya nagkaroon tayo ng second definition. So who is a Filipino child under the second definition? Always remember that under the second definition, a Filipino child is any person 18 years old and above who cannot fully take care of themselves because of a physical or mental defect. I repeat. Pag sinabi natin na Filipino child under the second definition, ibig sabihin, you are a person 18 years old and above who cannot fully take care of yourself because of a physical or mental defect. So, ang main point ng Filipino child under the second definition is that you are suffering from a physical or maybe a mental defect or disorder. Because of this defect or disorder, you can no longer fully take care of yourself. Hindi mo kayang buhayin yung sarili mo. Ma'am, bakit? Kasi nga, you are suffering from the physical or maybe the mental defect. Okay? Now, sino ba kasing perfect example natin under the second definition? Always remember that under the second definition, dito papasok yung mga imbeciles natin. Ma'am, who is an imbecile? Always remember that An imbecile is a person of advanced age whose mentality is comparable to a 2 to 7 years old. I repeat, an imbecile is a person of advanced age whose mentality is comparable to a 2 to 7 years old. Ibig sabihin, yung age mo, hindi siya nagmamatch doon sa mentality mo. Kasi imagine, advanced na yung age mo, pero yung pag-iisip mo, na-stuck ngayon sa mentality ng 2 to 7 years old. Ano ang tawag sa'yo? An imbecile. Now, take note, once an imbecile, always an imbecile. Okay? Hindi siya kagaya ng insane na may lucid interval. For an imbecile, their condition is continuing. Okay? Once an imbecile, always an imbecile. Kaya nga, ang iisipin ninyo under the law, an imbecile is always exempted from criminal liability. So, because of their defect, because of the mental disorder, ano ang sabi ng law natin? They are always exempted from criminal liability. Ibig sabihin, these imbeciles cannot be incarcerated, but they need to pay the civil liability, or maybe their parents or guardians would have to pay their civil liability. No criminal liability, but there is civil liability. That is your imbecile. Okay? Ano siya? Example siya ng Filipino child under the second definition. So imagine you're already 30 years old, pero hindi mo pa rin kayang buhayin yung sarili mo. Why? Kasi nga, you're suffering from a mental defect. Ano ka? You are an imbecile. And under the law, anong sabi? Although you are already an adult based on age, you are still considered as a Filipino child under the law. Okay? Next, you have what we call your insane. An insane is a person suffering from a mental defect or a mental disorder. Better discussions, gagawin nyo yan in your human behavior. Basang alam natin, if you are an insane, you are suffering from a mental defect. Now, kahit jutanders ka na, even if adult ka na, you are still considered as a Filipino child under the law. Why? Kasi because of that mental defect, you cannot fully take care of yourself. So, an insane is considered as a Filipino child under the second definition, even if adult na siya. By the way, ang iisipin ninyo, if you are talking about an insane, they have what you call your lucid interval. Unlike an imbecile na laging imbecile, an insane is not always insane. They have what you call a lucid interval. Ma'am, what do you mean by lucid interval? Lucid interval is the normal state of an insane. Ibig sabihin, this is the period of time whereby the insane would be acting normally. He would be thinking normally. It is his sane state. Ibig sabihin, normal siyang mag-isip. That is his lucid interval. Now, ang insane are not always exempted. They are only exempted in terms of criminal liability if they acted during insanity state. If they acted during their lucid interval, always remember, they are not considered as exempted. They are only exempted if they acted during their insanity state. If they acted during lucid interval, hindi sila exempt from criminal liability. Okay? So anyway, ang isipin nyo lang dyan ha, an insane is considered as a Filipino child under the second definition. So even if they are already adults, they are still considered Filipino children. Okay? So that would be your Filipino child. Number 1, any person under 18 years old. Or maybe number 2, any person 18 years old and above who cannot fully take care of themselves because of a physical or mental defect. Under physical or mental defect, pinag-usapan natin si imbecile. Pinag-usapan natin si insane. No worries kasi mamaya, pag pumunta na tayo sa mga disabled child, pag-uusapan natin ngayon kung ano ba yung physical defect na yan, ano ba yung mental defect na yan, and so on and so forth. Okay? By the way, please do not forget that the unborn child is still considered as a child. Okay? The unborn is still considered as a Filipino child. Ibig sabihin, kahit fetus ka pa lang, you are already considered as a Filipino child. Okay? Take note ha. The right to life starts upon conception. So the right to life starts upon conception. So because it starts upon conception, you already expect that upon conception, this person is already considered as a child even if hindi pa siya completely delivered sa mundong to. Okay, that is your first terminology. You have the word child. Next, you have what you call your dependent child. So you have what you call a dependent child. Now, ang iisipin lang ninyo para madali nyo siyang maalala. A dependent child is any person without a parent or a guardian. I repeat, a dependent child is a person without a parent or a guardian who is dependent upon the public for support. So, a dependent child is a person without a parent or a guardian who is dependent upon the public for support. For the last time, okay? Easy definition. Pag sinabi nating dependent child, this is a person who is without a parent or a guardian who is dependent upon the public for support. So, ito lang iisipin nyo. Whenever you talk about a dependent child, it does not talk about a child na umaasa pa sa mga magulang niya. No. Okay? Kasi nga sabi natin, ang dependent child ninyo, wala siyang parent, wala siyang guardian. Okay? Or maybe, in some instance or in some cases, the parents or maybe the guardian, for good cause, desires to be relieved of his care and custody. So, ibig sabihin, there are cases na totally wala siyang parents or guardian or di naman kaya may parent or guardian siya pero the parent or guardian for good cause, okay, desires now na mawala sa kanya yung care at saka custody ng batang yan. So because of that, mapapansin nyo, sino ngayon ang susuporta dun sa bata? So because there is no one to support the child who would be supporting the child, of course that would be the public. Okay? Kaya nga sabi natin, a dependent child is a person without a parent or a guardian who is dependent upon the public for support. So when you say dependent child, ang iisipin nyo lang ha, for purposes of support, they depend on the public. Hindi sila dumidepende sa mga magulang nila. They are depending on the public for support. That would be your dependent child. Ma'am, anong perfect example niyan? You now have the children found on the so-called orphanages. Okay? O di naman kaya yung mga bata sa mga silungan centers ninyo. What would you notice? Ang bumubuhay sa kanila would be the state. That would be the public. Okay? So that is your dependent child. So next term, you have the word abandoned child. If you say abandoned child, this refers to a person who has no proper parental care or guardianship, or whose parents or guardian has deserted him for a period of 6 continuous months. I repeat, pag sinabi natin na abandoned child, this is a person who has no proper parental care or guardianship, or whose parents or guardian has deserted him for 6 continuous months. Take note, pag sinabi kasi natin na abandoned, ibig sabihin, you were deserted. Ibig sabihin, nagkaroon ng seizure of support. Ibig sabihin yan, na-condemn yung tao. Ibig sabihin, napabayaan yung tao. Yun yung sinasabi ng abandoned child. Therefore, sa abandoned child natin, for you to be considered as abandoned, you need to make sure that the desertion should last for at least 6 continuous months. I repeat, the desertion should last for at least 6 continuous months. Kasi, if ang nangyari ngayon is you were left on your own, your parental care or maybe guardianship was not given to you for maybe 8 months, pero putol-putol siya, hindi siya tuloy-tuloy. So, maybe 8 months yan, pero naipon siya. Is that, or are you considered as an abandoned child? Definitely, the answer is no. Ma'am, bakit no? Kasi, sabi nga, di ba, it should be 6 continuous months. Pag putol-putol yan, you are not considered an abandoned child. Ma'am, ano ako? Maliban sa kawawa, you are considered as a neglected child. So, who is a neglected child? Please do remember that a neglected child is a person whose basic needs have been, number 1, deliberately unattended to, or maybe number 2, inadequately attended to. I repeat, pag sinabi natin na neglected child, sino siya? This refers to a person whose basic needs have been, number 1, deliberately unattended to, or maybe number 2, inadequately attended to. For the last time, who is a neglected child? This is a person whose basic needs have been, number 1, deliberately unattended to, or maybe number 2, inadequately attended to. Ibig sabihin, guys, for you to be considered as a neglected child, yung parents mo or maybe yung guardian mo, yung basic needs mo, deliberately, hindi nila pinoprovide. So, sinadya na totally walang pinoprovide sa basic needs mo. Kaya nga, deliberately unattended. Sadya, tapos totaling wala. Or maybe, number 2, inadequately attended to. Pag sinabi nating inadequate, meron pero kulang. So, ibig sabihin, yes, they are providing, yes, they are giving, yun nga lang, hindi siya sapat. Okay? So, considered ka na neglected child in 2 cases. Sabi natin, number 1, your basic needs have been deliberately unattended to. Ibig sabihin, sadya at totally, wala talaga. Or maybe, number 2, inadequately attended to. Meaning, meron pero kulang. Okay? So, take for instance, kunyari ako, I have a child. Yung anak ko, provide ko naman yung basic needs niya, kaya lang kulang. So, try to imagine 13 ang anak ko. Tapos, magsasayang ako ng 3 cups of rice. Now, question, meron bang na-provide na food? Meron. Pero question, I have 13 mouths to feed. Sapat ba ang 3 cups of rice? The answer would be no. Meron pero kulang. Or maybe, totaling wala lang talaga. Ma'am, how would I know kung neglected child ba siya or abandoned child? Kasi yung abandoned child natin, similar siya dun sa unang qualification ng neglected child. Ang iisipin lang ninyo, ang abandoned child, oo, neglected child din siya. Yun nga lang, the neglect now would be for a period of 6 continuous months na totally hindi na provide yung needs ng bata. So, pag nakita nyo na there is already 6 continuous months, take note hindi accumulated 6 months, hindi naipon. Ang sabi, at least 6 continuous months. Do not write there neglected, you go for abandoned child. Okay? So, ganyan lang siya. That is your neglected child. So, based on that, meron tayong types of neglect. Kasi we are already talking about a neglected child, di ba? Pero ano ba kasi yung neglect na pinag-uusapan natin? Please do remember that neglect is inaction or lack of action. I repeat, when you talk about neglect, ano siya? Neglect is inaction or lack of action. Ibig sabihin, it's possible na totaling wala kang ginawa or maybe meron pero kulang. Okay? So, yan yung neglect natin. Now, under the law kasi, there are 2 classifications or types of neglect. The neglect could be physical or maybe the neglect could be emotional. Ang iisipin lang ninyo, there is physical neglect if there is failure to provide the basic needs or the physiological needs of a person. I repeat, there is physical neglect kailan? If there is failure to provide the basic needs or maybe the physiological needs of a person. So, saan ka nagkulang? Or maybe, ano yung hindi mo ma-provide? Yung basic needs. Ma'am, ano ba yung basic needs na yan? This would not pertain to the physiological or biological needs of a person. Perfect example, you have their food, you have their clothing, you have their shelter. Ang mga to are physiological needs. So, failure to provide such or maybe if kulang yung pinoprovide mo na ganyan, ano siya? That is physical neglect. Now, what would be the most common symptom that there is already physical neglect? So, paano mo nalalaman na hala, parang may physical neglect na ata? Tignan ninyo. if the child is malnourished, or maybe if the child is ill-clad, ibig sabihin sakitin siya, or maybe the child is without proper shelter. So, sa without proper shelter, ang isipin nyo dyan, kunyari, oo, meron naman siyang tinutuluyan, meron siyang tinitirahan. Pero ano yung tirahan niya? Mobile housing. Ma'am, anong mobile housing? Kariton. Saan siya nakatira? Sa kariton. Meron, pero question, sapat ba yan or proper ba yan na shelter? The answer is no. Ibig sabihin, there is still physical neglect. Another example, in Cebu, when we were there, merong family of Badjaus. Meron silang 13 na anak. Tapos noon, saan sila nakatira? Beachfront eh. So, yung tirahan nila sa harap lang mismo ng beach. Now, maawa ka kasi yung bahay nila, gawa lang siya sa 4 na stick ng kawayan tapos dahon-dahon. Kumbaga ba, umulan lang ng konti, masisira na yung tinutuluyan nila. So, anong mapapansin nyo dito? Meron, pero it is not a proper shelter. Anong meron dyan? Physical neglect. Okay? On the other hand, pag sinabi na lang naman natin na emotional neglect, ang iisipin lang ninyo, it talks about allowing a child to be placed in moral danger. I repeat, there is emotional neglect if you now allow a child to be placed in moral danger. Ibig sabihin, not necessarily na may gagawin ka dun sa bata. Dito, kaya siya tinawag na neglect kasi you now allowed the child to be placed in moral danger. Ibig sabihin, you allowed the child to be exposed to different dangers surrounding him. Yun yung sinasabi nating emotional neglect. So, ma'am, ano yung mga possible na examples dyan? Kunyari, if you allow a child to be working under the streets or maybe in public places, so yung bata, hinahayaan mo siyang mag-work doon. So, ano siya? Merong emotional neglect. Kasi if you allow a child to be working or if you exploit him or maybe you overwork him or maybe you allow him to work under streets or maybe public places, ang sabi, there is what? Emotional neglect. Ma'am, ano pa? If you allow the child to be exposed to drugs, alcohol, prostitution, o kaya other forms of vices, anong meron dyan? Emotional neglect. So, parang kunyari ikaw, you have a child. Ngayon, ang ginagawa mo, you smoke in front of your child. Question, sinasaktan mo ba yung bata? No. Tinuruan mo ba siyang magyosi? No. Pero you allow him to watch you smoke. Ibig sabihin, you are now allowing this child or you are now putting this child in moral danger. Anong meron dyan? Emotional neglect. So, I repeat ha, neglect is inaction or lack of action. There are 2 types of neglect. You have their physical neglect, meaning, anong nangyari dito? There is a failure to provide the basic or physiological needs of the child. On the other hand, pag emotional neglect naman, it talks about putting or allowing a child to be placed in moral danger. Okay? So, these are the types of your neglect. So now, pag-usapan natin yung tinatawag nyo na disabled child. Always remember that a disabled child refers to a child or a person suffering from a physical, psychological, or mental defect. I repeat, a disabled child is a person or a child suffering from a physical, psychological, or mental defect. Ibig sabihin, these people are having defects or maybe disorders. Yung disorder or defect nila, or sorry for the term, abnormality nila, would be physically, psychologically, or maybe mentally. So there is an abnormality. And because of that abnormality, they are now considered as disabled. Now, mind you, pag disabled child yan, if that disability now causes the person to be unable to take care of himself, ibig sabihin, he cannot fully take care of himself because of the disability. Ano ang sabi? He or she now would be considered as a Filipino child under the second definition. Ibig sabihin, whatever age he belongs, kahit ano pang edad niya, basta the disability now causes him not to be able to fully take care of himself, he is always regarded as a Filipino child under the second definition. Okay, pinag-usapan natin yan kanina. Now, there are different kinds of disabled child. Pag-usapan natin sila, dyan yung makikita yung May physical disability, psychological disability, tapos yung tinatawag natin na mental disability. So let's try to go over them. Number 1, you have what you call a mentally retarded child. If you say mentally retarded child, obviously, this person suffers from a mental disorder or a mental defect. Now, paano natin siya madedelineate from other people who also are suffering from mental disabilities? Please do remember that a mentally retarded is a person who is socially incompetent and is unable to manage his own affairs. I repeat, this person is socially incompetent and is unable to manage his own affairs. Ibig sabihin, this person cannot normally socialize with other people. And because of that, he's also unable to manage his own affairs. He cannot really perform his activities properly. Yun yung mga mentally retarded natin. Now, ang iisipin nyo, a mentally retarded child is suffering from mental retardation. Though nowadays, we no longer call it mental retardation but rather ang tawag na natin is intellectual disability. Please do remember that whenever you talk about mental retardation or yung tinatawag natin na intellectual disability, the person now is suffering from a cognitive delay. Ibig sabihin, the person is suffering from a slow processing of information. Ibig sabihin, oo, they are able to understand information pero it takes them too much time in order to process it. No worries kasi, ang intellectual disability or mental retardation would be tackled more on your human behavior subject. Okay? So that is a mentally retarded child. Take note, this person is socially incompetent and is unable to manage his own affairs. Why? Kasi nga, they have a delay in cognitive processing. Ibig sabihin, there is a delay in their information processing. So, anong disability meron siya? A mental disability. Okay? Let's now go to the second one. You have what you call a physically handicapped child. When you say physically handicapped child, always remember that the child is suffering from a physical abnormality. So, nasaan yung defect? Nasaan yung disorder? Nasa physical aspect ng tao. That's why, whenever you talk about a physically handicapped child, always remember that this person suffers from a physical abnormality which restricts his means of action or communication. I repeat, this person suffers from a physical abnormality which restricts his means of action or communication. Ibig sabihin, because of the physical or the biological abnormality, there is now a limitation or a restriction on the activities of the person or maybe his communications with other people. Perfect example, you have what you call your deaf-mute. When you say deaf-mute, it means that the person cannot hear and at the same time cannot talk. Now, although hindi siya physically visible, hindi mo siya nakikita agad, di ba, by merely looking at the person. Ang defect or abnormality is still on the physical aspect of the person. It is still on the body of the person. Now, if you would notice, anong restricted sa taong to? Primarily yung communications niya. Yes, affected ang actions niya, pero primarily ang mas affected would be his so-called communications. Another example, you also have a person, okay, who is unable to walk. Yung mga lumpo, yung mga pilay, di ba? Itong mga taong to are suffering from a physical abnormality kasi nga they cannot walk, di ba? Now, because of that abnormality, that biological anomaly, that biological defect or disorder, what now happens? Nagkakaroon ng restriction or maybe limitation on the action of the person. Okay? Kasi di ba they cannot walk. So, ibig sabihin, restricted ang actions nila. Number 3, you have what you call an emotionally disturbed child. Ang iisipin nyo, an emotionally disturbed child is a person not afflicted with a mental defect. I repeat, this is a person who is not afflicted with a mental defect, but is unable to maintain normal social relations because of emotional problems. I repeat, an emotionally disturbed child is a person not afflicted with a mental defect but is unable to maintain normal social relations because of an emotional problem. For the last time, pag sinabi nating emotionally disturbed child, this person is not insane. This person is not suffering from a mental disorder. But, kahit wala siyang mental defect, kahit wala siyang problem sa utak, this person still is unable to maintain normal social relations. Ibig sabihin, he cannot normally socialize with other people. Why? Kasi meron siyang emotional problems. Ibig sabihin, an emotionally disturbed child is a person na hindi kayang mag-form ng normal relations with other people dahil may pinagdadaanan sila. Parang kayo lang yan, di ba? If you are having a problem, family man yan, love life man yan, or whatsoever, affected yung actions mo, affected yung pag-iisip mo ng tinatawag na emotions. And because of that, you are not able to function properly. Ganun din yung mga emotionally disturbed children. These people are not insane. They do not have any mental defects. But they cannot socialize normally. Why? Because of the emotional problems that they are suffering. That's your emotionally disturbed child. Okay? So, ang perfect example natin dyan would be children who were abused when they were young. Maliban kasi sa physical trauma, merong psychological trauma din yung mga batang yan. So, they become emotionally disturbed. O di naman kaya yung mga sexually abused, di ba? They become man-haters. Why? Kasi merong pinagdadaanan yung batang yan. Next. The last one, you have what you call a mentally ill child. Now, ang iisipin nyo sa mentally ill child, iba siya sa mentally retarded. Pag mentally retarded, hindi baliw ang mga yan. Nagkataon lang that they are slow in processing information. On the other hand, when you talk about a mentally ill child, always remember that this person is suffering from a behavioral disorder which is of such a degree of severity as to require professional help or hospitalization. I repeat, this is a person who has a behavioral disorder which is of such a degree of severity as to require professional help or hospitalization. Last na talaga. So, anong sabi? This is a person who has a behavioral disorder which is of such a degree of severity as to require professional help or hospitalization. What do I mean? Ibig sabihin, the person is suffering from a mental problem. Because of the mental problem, it now produces a behavioral disorder. The behavior of the person becomes abnormal. And take note, because of that mental disorder that produced the behavioral disorder, nagre-require siya ngayon ng hospitalization or nagre-require siya ngayon ng professional help. Why? Kasi at the end of the day, malala na yung situation. Perfect example of a person suffering from a mental disorder falling under this category would be the insane. So, sinong perfect example natin ng mentally ill? You now have those who are suffering from insanity. Yung merong mga schizophrenia. If you would come and notice it, these people are already lost contact with reality. Ibig sabihin, malala na yung degree ng disorder nila. And because of said severity, nagre-require ngayon na ma-hospitalize sila or nagre-require ngayon ng professional assistance or professional help. Kasi take note, ang insanity ninyo, ang mental illness worsens as time goes by. Okay? Hindi siya nag-cure as time passes by, but rather, lumalala siya. So because of that, anong sabi? Uy, we already need professional help. Uy, kailangan na natin siyang ipa-hospitalize. Kaya nga, di ba, we have a lot of mental asylums catering to this mentally ill children. Okay? So, ganun lang siya. Itong apat na to ang iisipin nyo All of them are typologies of disabled children. Mentally retarded and mentally ill, mental disorders yung mga yan. Okay? Mental disability. Pag physically handicapped naman, biological yung problem, nasa katawan. Pag emotionally disturbed naman, alam natin na yan yung psychological problem or psychological defect or disorder. Okay? So these four are kinds of disabled children. Next term, you have what you call your commitment or surrender of a child. Please do remember that this is the legal act of entrusting a child to the care of the department or any duly licensed child placement agency or individual. Now, I repeat, when you talk about commitment or surrender of a child, it is the legal act of entrusting a child to the care of the department or any duly licensed child placement agency or individual. Now, when you hear the term department, we are talking about the Department of Social Welfare and Development. So, nung pinag-uusapan natin, DSWD. So, if yung bata, isusurrender mo, or maybe you would be relinquishing his care, or maybe you would be entrusting the care of this child to the DSWD, ang tawag natin dyan is commitment or surrender of a child. Or maybe, kung ayaw mo naman sa DSWD, it's also possible that you entrust the child to a duly licensed child placement agency. Mama yung child placement agency, pag-uusapan natin siya later pag andun na tayo sa child caring and child placement agency. Just remember, in commitment or surrender of a child, what do? We now surrender, or maybe we now entrust, or maybe we now relinquish the care of the child to the DSWD, or maybe to a child placement agency or individual. Now, please do remember na there are two kinds of children who are committed or surrendered. I repeat, there are two kinds of children who are committed or maybe surrendered. Ano yung dalawang yan? Pwede siyang involuntary committed child or maybe voluntary committed child. So what would be the difference? When you say involuntary committed child, this is a person whose parents had been permanently and judicially deprived of parental authority because of their failure to satisfy parental responsibility. I repeat, an involuntary committed child is a person whose parents had been permanently and judicially deprived of parental authority because of their failure to satisfy parental responsibility. Doon pa lang sa pangalan or doon pa lang sa status ng batang yan, you would already know na ayaw ng parents, most probably they do not want to surrender the child or maybe they do not want that their child would be taken away from them. Kaya lang, they are left with no other choice but to surrender or commit the child kasi nga, they are failures in terms of satisfying their parental responsibility. Take note. For every right, there is always parental responsibility. Kaya nga later on, we would talk about your parental authority. Doon yung makikita na under parental authority, you have right and you have responsibilities as parents. If the government determines that as parents, you failed to provide or maybe you failed to satisfy your parental responsibilities, ano ang possibility? Kukunin nila yung bata sa inyo. Even if you don't want it, you do not have any other choice but to surrender your child. Why? Kasi nga, you were not able to satisfy what is required by law as a responsibility on your part as parents. Perfect example. As a parent, you need to provide the basic needs of the child. Pero imagine, the government came to discover na hala, hindi ka pala nagpro-provide ng basic needs ng bata. Na hala, etong batang to pala hindi naaaruga ng mabuti ng parents nila. Or maybe hala, tong batang to inaabuso ng mga magulang niya. In such cases, kahit ayaw mo as parent na kunin yung anak mo, anong mangyayari? You are left with no other choice but to surrender your child. Ma'am, ba't ganun? Kasi there is already a judicial order. Kaya nga, if you would come and notice it, sa definition ng involuntary child, ang sabi doon, permanently and judicially deprived of parental authority. Ibig sabihin, it was the court's decision to deprive you of your parental authority kasi based on the decision of the court, palpak ka as a parent. Okay? That is your involuntary committed child. Or maybe, possible din naman na nagkaroon ng commitment of a child pero yung child committed is a voluntary committed child. Of course, makikita nyo ngayon doon sa pangalan ng status na yan na it is the exact opposite of an involuntary committed child. Ma'am, bakit? Kasi, whenever you talk about a voluntary committed child, this refers to a person whose parents knowingly and willingly relinquished parental authority to the department. I repeat, this is a person whose parents knowingly and willingly relinquished parental authority to the department. Knowingly, ibig sabihin, alam nila. Willingly, ibig sabihin, no one forced them. Ibig sabihin, no one coerced them. It was based on their own will para isurrender yung bata. Kaya nga siya voluntary. Alam nila, tapos ginusto nila na isuko yung parental authority nila over the child. Anong tawag? Voluntarily committed child. Now, there are different reasons kung bakit nagkakaroon ng voluntarily committed child. Ma'am, ano yung mga yon? It's possible that the parents find it hard to satisfy their parental responsibility. Ibig sabihin, there are cases whereby alam ng parents sa sarili nila na even if they want to take care of the child, hindi talaga nila kaya. So because they cannot really finance or maybe provide the basic needs of the child, they would rather surrender the child to the care of the government para ma-providean talaga yung needs ng bata. So maybe they cannot provide the basic needs. That's why they knowingly and willingly surrender the child. Or maybe possible din na the child is incorrigible. When you say incorrigible, it means that the child is not capable of change. Ibig sabihin, sobrang tigas ng ulo. Sulpong nga talaga. Okay? So because of that, ano ang sabi? Because the parents feel that they can no longer discipline the child, which is part of parental responsibility. Because they feel that they can no longer discipline said child, ano ang gagawin nila? They would now surrender the child to the care of the government. Para yung government ngayon ang swesweto dun sa bata kasi nga sobrang tigas ng ulo. Okay? And many more. Anong tawag sa mga yan? Voluntary committed child. Take note, it's voluntary kasi it was knowingly and willingly done. Alam nila at ginusto nila. Okay? So involuntary, from the term itself, the parents do not want to, but they are forced to do so. Why? They failed the satisfaction of their parental responsibility. On the other hand, pag voluntary committed child naman yan, alam nila, ginusto nila. So knowingly and willingly. Why? Because they know that they cannot really provide for the needs of that child. Okay? So yun lang siya. Voluntary at involuntary committed child. These are the types of children who are committed or surrendered. So let's talk about a child placement agency. I have mentioned this term kanina when I was talking about your commitment or surrender of a child. Ito yung isang institution na pwede mong pag-surrenderan if ayaw mong isurrender sa DSWD. Anyway, when you talk about a child placement agency, mag-bullets tayo para madali nyo siyang maalala. First bullet, a child placement agency is a private, non-profit institution or government agency. I repeat, it is a private, non-profit institution or government agency. Ibig sabihin, pwede siyang owned by a private person or maybe it is owned by the government itself. Ang sigurado lang natin, private man yan or government agency man yan, it is always a non-profit institution. Ibig sabihin, it is not a business. Ibig sabihin, it is not for money making. Ibig sabihin, hindi siya commercial in nature. Kaya siya non-profit. That's the first bullet. So, number 2, okay, number 2 bullet, anong sabi natin dyan? You write there that it is duly licensed and accredited by the department. I repeat, it is duly licensed and accredited by the department. So, you already know what is the department, right? Pinag-usapan na natin siya kanina. Now, basing it on the second bullet, ang iisipin lang ninyo, yung child placing or child placement agency ninyo was given authority by the government to operate. Okay? So, ibig sabihin yan, dahil nga it's licensed, it is accredited, ibig sabihin, they are authorized by the government to operate. Okay? So, ganun lang siya. Go now to number 3. Ang iisipin ninyo for your third bullet, it is for adoption purposes. I repeat, it is for adoption purposes. Now, madaling maalala ang child placement agency. Kasi from the term placement, ibig sabihin, you place a child to a family, right? What happens in adoption? You place a child in a family. So, pag nakita nyo placement, ibig sabihin, you place the child in a family. Anong nangyayari dyan? Adoption. So, ang primary purpose ng child placement or child placing agency is for adoption purposes. Ibig sabihin, they are in charge of receiving applications for adoption. They are in charge of finding a possible family for a person or for a child who wants or maybe who needs to be put in a family. Okay? Ganyan yung nangyayari sa adoption. Sinong in charge pag adoption? Child placement or child placing agency. Anong perfect example natin dyan? You have what you call an orphanage. Bahay ampunan. Yung mga bahay ampunan ninyo, ano bang trabaho nila doon? Maghanap sila ng suitable family para sa mga orphans. What do? They now try to place the child in a family. Okay? That is your child placement or child placing agency. 3 points ha. It is a private non-profit institution or government agency. Number 2, it is duly licensed and accredited by the department. Number 3, it is for adoption purposes. That is your child placement agency. Now, na pinag-uusapan na rin lamang natin kung ano ang trabaho ng child placement agency, pag-usapan natin ang adoption ninyo. So, what is adoption? Adoption is the process of making a child, whether related or not to the adopter, possess in general the rights accorded to a legitimate child. I repeat, adoption is the process of making a child, whether related or not to the adopter, possess in general the rights accorded to a legitimate child. Short to say, when you talk about adoption, it is the process of according a child the rights of a legitimate child. I repeat, it is the process of according a child the rights of a legitimate child. Ibig sabihin, in your adoption, you are now making this child possess the rights of a legitimate child. Ma'am, bakit ba kasi kailangan maging legitimate siya? Pag-uusapan natin yan later if ando doon na tayo sa status of a child. Just remember, ano ang purpose ng adoption ninyo? It is to allow the child to have the rights of a legitimate child. Anong beauty ng adoption? Pwedeng magkaroon ng adoption whether or not the adopted child is related or not to the adopter. So I do not care kung related ba siya or complete stranger ba siya dun sa adopting parents. Basta ang alam natin, if the adoption was valid or legally done, this child now would be possessing the rights of a legitimate child. Kaya nga no offense naman, pero an adopted child has better rights compared to an illegitimate child. Now, of course, pag-uusapan natin later. Okay? Now, whenever we talk about adoption in the Philippines, dalawa kasi yan. Pwede siyang domestic adoption, pwede siyang inter-country adoption. The first one, domestic adoption muna tayo. Your domestic adoption is governed by RA 8552. I repeat ha, pag domestic adoption, ano daw? It is governed by RA 8552. Take note, ano siya? You call that the Domestic Adoption Act. Ma'am, what is domestic adoption? When you say domestic adoption, it is the adoption of Filipino children, whereby the entire adoption process, beginning from the filing of the petition up to the issuance of the adoption decree, takes place in the Philippines. I repeat, when you say domestic adoption, ano siya? It is the adoption of a Filipino child or the adoption of Filipino children, whereby the entire adoption process, beginning from the filing of the petition up to the issuance of the adoption decree, takes place in the Philippines. Now, for you to easily remember what is domestic adoption, ang iisipin nyo lang, it is the adoption of a Filipino child, which happens in the Philippines. I repeat, it is what? It is the adoption of a Filipino child which happens in the Philippines. So, ibig sabihin, the whole adoption process, from the filing of the petition up to the issuance of the adoption decree, saan siya nangyari, it all happened in the Philippines, meaning the whole procedure or the whole transaction of the adoption of said Filipino child happened here in the Philippines. Anong tawag dyan? Domestic adoption. Now, ganito. Ang iisipin nyo, pag adoption kasi ang pinag-uusapan, you need to know who can adopt. Sino ba yung pwedeng maging adopting parents? So, take note, who can adopt under your domestic adoption law? Number 1, you have their Filipino citizens. So, sa domestic adoption, sino ang pwedeng mag-adopt? You have their Filipino citizens. Number 2, you have their foreigners. I repeat, you have their foreigners. Tapos number 3, you now have guardians with respect to their ward. I repeat, who can adopt? Number 1, Filipino citizens. Number 2, aliens. And number 3, guardians with respect to their ward. Kasi take note, pag ako yung guardian mo, anong tawag sa'yo? Ikaw yung ward. Ang sabi ng law, yung guardian, pwede niyang ampunin yung ward niya provided ma-terminate muna yung guardianship at magkaroon ng clearance ng lahat ng financial accountabilities niya. So, upon the termination of the guardianship, and there was already a clearance of his financial accountabilities, anong sabi? This guardian now is allowed to adopt his ward. Okay? So, tatlo ha. Who can adopt? Filipino citizens. Number 2, foreigners. And number 3, guardians with respect to their ward. Now, ano ang iisipin ninyo if a Filipino decides to adopt? Okay, so what are the qualifications in order to allow a Filipino citizen to adopt? Take note. Number 1, must be of legal age. I repeat, ano yung unang qualification so that a Filipino could adopt? He must be of legal age. Ibig sabihin, he should at least be 18 years old. Kasi yun ang legal age natin in the Philippines eh. It is the time na you are already considered as an adult. Next, kailangan, okay, meron tayong tinatawag na 16 years age gap. I repeat, there should be a 16 years age gap. Okay? So sabi, dapat of legal age ka. Tapos, number 2, you should at least be 16 years older than the adoptee. Ibig sabihin, may 16 years age gap kayo. Ibig sabihin, guys, even if I am already 18, so of legal age na ako, pwede ba akong mag-ampon ng 10 years old? Is it allowed? Tignan natin. Are you of legal age? Yes. Pero question, gaano kalaki yung age gap ninyo? So if it's 10 and you are 18, nasa almost 8 years lang yung age gap nyo. Pwede mo bang i-adapt yung bata? The answer is no. Ma'am, bakit no? Kasi hindi mo na-satisfy yung requirement na 16 years age gap. That's the general rule eh. So sabi, oo, you are of legal age tapos at least meron kayong 16 years age gap. Pero take note, the 16 years age gap does not apply if the adopter is a biological parent of the adoptee. I repeat, okay? The 16 years age gap is not required or does not apply if the adopter is a biological parent of the adoptee. Ibig sabihin, you don't need to satisfy the 16 years age gap if yung aampon, biological parent siya nung batang aampunin. Ma'am, kailan nangyayari yan? It usually happens in cases whereby the child is an illegitimate child. Ibig sabihin, anak siya sa labas. So, dahil illegitimate child siya, tapos kunyari, there's no way para maging legitimate yung status niya, the only remedy left is for the biological parent to adopt his own child. Ma'am, bakit? Kasi ang purpose natin sa adoption is to assure that this child now would possess the rights of a legitimate child. So, illegitimate siya, you are left with no other choice, wala ka nang magawa para maging legitimate siya, anong option mo? You do an adoption. So, same rule, dapat of legal age ka. Pero question, do you still need the 16 years age gap? The answer is no. Okay? Ma'am, kailan pa hindi kailangan ng 16 years age gap? You don't need to satisfy the age gap required if the adopter is the spouse of the adoptee's parent. I repeat, the adopter is the spouse of the adoptee's parent. Ibig sabihin, yung biological parent nung aampunin, okay, nagkaroon siya ng asawa. Ngayon, yung asawa niya, hindi niya biological child yung bata. Kaninong biological child yon? Doon sa spouse niya, doon sa asawa niya. Pero siya mismo, hindi niya biological child yung bata. Now, gusto niyang ampunin yung anak ng asawa niya. So, anong gagawin niya ngayon? He is going to adopt said child. Kailangan pa ba nung 16 years age gap? The answer is no. Okay? Take for instance. Kunyari yung parent, okay? Kinasal na siya dati. Tapos noon, ang nangyari, yung husband niya namatay. Yung husband niya namatay at saka siya, meron silang biological child. So, status is legitimate, right? When the husband died, a few years later, etong wife, nag-asawa ulit siya ng iba. So, ngayon, yung bagong asawa niya, biological child niya ba yung bata? The answer is no. Question, legitimate child niya ba yung bata? The answer is no. Okay? Kasi yung batang yon is the child of the first marriage. Ngayon, mabait tong bagong husband niya. Gusto niya na maging legitimate child niya yung anak ng asawa niya sa first marriage. So, ano ang gagawin niya? He is now going to adopt the child of the spouse. So, anong gagawin niya? He is going to adopt the child of his spouse. So, kailangan pa ba nung 16 years age gap? The answer is no. Okay? So, ganun siya ha. So, take note, ang rule natin, a Filipino citizen, in order to adopt, must be of legal age and at the same time must have a 16 years age gap with the adoptee. Pero, may exception. Yung 16 years age gap does not need to be satisfied if, letter A, the adopter is the biological parent of the adoptee, or maybe, letter B, the adopter is the spouse of the adoptee's parent. Okay? So, ganyan siya ha. Do not forget that about your domestic adoption made by a Filipino citizen. So, still on domestic adoption tayo ha. Puntan natin yung second na pwedeng mag-adopt. Of course, you have a foreigner or an alien. Take note na kahit na domestic adoption yan, allowed pa rin mag-adopt yung foreigner. Provided, considered siya na domestic adoption if the whole process or the whole procedure of the adoption started here in the Philippines and ended here in the Philippines. And the subject, of course, is a Filipino child. So, ano ba yung qualification? So that a foreigner would be allowed to adopt a Filipino child. Of course, sabi dyan, letter A, the foreigner must possess the qualifications of a Filipino adopter. Ibig sabihin, required pa rin yung age, tapos required pa rin yung tinatawag natin na 16 years age gap. Yun nga lang guys, okay, ang iisipin nyo dito, ano siya? Foreigner siya. Okay, he is a foreigner. Pero required pa rin, again, yung sinasabi natin na of legal age, meaning, okay, 18 or pataas yan, tapos dapat may 16 years age gap between him and the adoptee. Second, his country has diplomatic relation with the Philippines. Ibig sabihin, okay, merong relationship yung country niya, tapos yung Philippines, diplomatic relations. Ibig sabihin, we have good relations with the country of that foreigner who wants to adopt here in the Philippines. Third, anong sabi? His government allows the adoptee to enter his country. Ibig sabihin, the foreigner must assure that if the adoption is completed, that his adoptee now, yung inampon niya, would be allowed to enter his home country. Okay? Yung bansa, kung taga saan yung foreigner. And of course, yung last na qualification or requirement, kailangan may certification from his government that he has legal capacity to adopt. Ibig sabihin, kung sana mag-aampon siya sa bansa niya, dapat yung bansa niya would certify na oo, in our country, this person is also allowed to adopt kasi he has legal capacity to adopt. Kailangan may ganong certification para ma-allow din siya na mag-adopt dito sa Philippines. Okay? By the way, as a general rule guys, as a general rule, if a foreigner would be the adopter in domestic adoption, as a general rule, at least he has been living in the Philippines for 3 continuous years. So I repeat has been living in the Philippines for at least 3 continuous years prior to the application for adoption. Ibig sabihin, as a general rule, itong foreigner na to, pwede siyang umampon under domestic adoption law, provided he had been living here in the Philippines for at least 3 continuous years prior to the application. Ibig sabihin, bago siyang mag-apply, tumira siya dito sa Philippines for a minimum of 3 continuous years. Tapos take note to prove that kailangan meron siyang residence dito sa Philippines. Okay? That's the rule. Pero itong general rule na to would be adhering to exceptions. Take note, yung 3 years residence requirement ni foreigner would not apply or is not required if he is a former Filipino who seeks to adopt a relative within the 4th civil degree. I do not care kung relative by consanguinity ba siya or affinity. I repeat the residence requirement of a minimum of 3 continuous years would not apply or need not be satisfied if he is or that foreigner is a former Filipino who seeks to adopt a relative within the 4th civil degree. Ibig sabihin, he does not need to satisfy the 3 continuous years residence requirement if dati naman siyang Filipino tapos yung gusto niyang ampunin, relative pa rin niya within the 4th civil degree. I do not care if it's via consanguinity, meaning by blood, or maybe by affinity, which means by marriage. Okay? Hindi rin kailangang isatisfy yung residence requirement na yan, number 2, if that foreigner is married to a Filipino and seeks to adopt jointly with his spouse a relative within the 4th degree of consanguinity or affinity. I repeat, he is married to a Filipino and seeks to adopt jointly with his spouse a relative within the 4th degree or within the 4th civil degree. Again, I do not care if it's consanguinity or affinity. What do I mean? Ibig sabihin, hindi na kailangang isatisfy yung residency requirement if etong foreigner na to kasal sa Filipino. Yung asawa niyang Filipino, okay, gusto niyang ampunin yung relative niya within the 4th civil degree. So as a consequence, anong mangyayari? Foreigner siya, married to a Filipino, ang gusto nilang mangyari is joint adoption. Sino yung jointly na i-adapt nila? Yung relative ng Filipino spouse within the fourth civil degree. Again, I repeat, I do not care if it's via consanguinity or maybe affinity. And of course, yung pangatlo, you don't need the satisfaction of the residence requirement if that foreigner is married to a Filipino and seeks to adopt the legitimate or illegitimate child of his Filipino spouse. I repeat, you do not need to satisfy the residence requirement even if you are a foreigner if you are married to a Filipino and you are now seeking to adopt the legitimate or illegitimate child of your Filipino spouse. Ibig sabihin, okay, kunyari, ako ay ma-Filipino. Tapos nun, married ako ngayon doon sa isang foreigner. Ngayon ako, meron akong legitimate or illegitimate child. Okay? I'm the Filipino, I have maybe a legitimate or illegitimate child. Ngayon, yung husband ko na foreigner, anong gusto niya? Gusto niyang ampunin yung legitimate or illegitimate child ko. So, anong sabi if that's the case? Hindi na kailangang isatisfy ng foreigner na spouse ko yung 3 years residency requirement. Okay? So, ganito ha, I repeat. General rule. Pag foreigner ang mag-a-adopt aside from the qualifications we have mentioned a while back, as a general rule, this foreigner, okay, should at least live in the Philippines for 3 continuous years prior to the application for adoption. Unless, okay, ito na yung exceptions nyo, unless, number 1, he is a former Filipino who seeks to adopt a relative within the fourth civil degree. Dating Pinoy, aampunin niya, relative niya within the fourth civil degree. No need for the residency requirement. Number 2, the foreigner is married to a Filipino and seeks to adopt jointly with his spouse a relative within the fourth civil degree. Ibig sabihin, itong foreigner na to, married sa isang Filipino, gusto nilang magkaroon ng joint adoption ng relative ng Filipino na asawa niya within again the fourth civil degree. Tapos yung pangatlo, the foreigner is married to a Filipino. Tapos, anong sabi? He now seeks to adopt the legitimate or illegitimate child of his Filipino spouse. Foreigner, kasal sa Pinoy, tapos gusto niyang ampunin yung legitimate or illegitimate child ng Filipino spouse. Okay? So, yun yung tatlong exceptions natin. Ito yung cases na hindi kailangan ng residency requirement. Okay? So, that would be for the adoption of a foreigner, adoption by a foreigner under your RA 8552. If you are going to look at the provisions of 8552, you would notice that as a general rule, it would always require what you call a joint adoption. Ibig sabihin, the husband and the wife shall adopt jointly. Hindi pwedeng isa lang. Kailangan si husband at si wife, kung mag-aampon sila, joint adoption. That's the general rule. Dahil general rule yan, alam na natin na merong exceptions. Nasa Philippines tayo eh. For every general rule, there's always an exception. Tatlo yan. Sabi ng exceptions, these are the cases that would allow individual adoptions by an individual spouse. Ibig sabihin, ito yung cases na inaalaw ng law na isa lang sa mag-asawa ang mag-aampon. Okay? Kasi ang general rule dapat joint eh. Pero under these 3 instances, pwede daw na isa lang sa kanila ang mag-ampon. So, ano yung tatlong instances na yon? Number 1, one spouse seeks to adopt the legitimate child of the other. So, yung isang spouse, kunyari si husband, gusto niyang ampunin yung legitimate child ng wife niya. Ito yung mga cases whereby, itong kunyari si mother, galing siya sa isang previous marriage. Doon sa previous marriage niya, nagkaroon sila ng anak ng former husband niya. Yung anak nila is a legitimate child. Ngayon, kunyari wala ning marriage, na-dissolve na yung prior marriage niya, nagpakasal siya ulit sa iba. Yung bagong asawa niya, kunyari yung bagong husband niya, illegitimate child niya yung bata eh. Hindi niya legitimate child yun. Okay? So, hindi niya legitimate child yung bata. So, ang gusto niya ngayon, maging legitimate child niya. So, what would he do? Aampunin niya ngayon yung legitimate child ng asawa niya. So, kunyari, husband would now adopt the legitimate child of his wife. Yun yung number 1. Number 2. One spouse seeks to adopt his own illegitimate child provided the other signifies his consent. Ibig sabihin, kunyari, husband and wife ulit. Kunyari si wife, meron siyang illegitimate child, meron siyang anak sa labas. Ngayon, para ma-elevate yung status ng bata into a legitimate child, aampunin niya yung illegitimate child niya. Allowed yon na siya lang ang umampon. Kaya lang, bago niya gawin yon, kailangan mag-signify yung asawa niya. Kailangan mag-signify kunyari si husband niya na etong wife na to, aampunin niya yung illegitimate child niya. So, kailangan mag-signify ng consent yung asawa. Kasi pag hindi nag-signify ng consent yung asawa, hindi pwedeng ampunin. Kunyari ni wife yung illegitimate child niya. Okay? Ganun siya. So, bakit aampunin ngayon kunyari ni wife yung sarili niyang anak? Kasi illegitimate Gusto niyang i-elevate yung status into a legitimate child. Pero kailangan laging may consent ng other spouse. Or maybe number 3, the spouses are legally separated. Ibig sabihin, they are no longer living together. So dahil hindi naman na sila magkabahay, dahil hiwalay naman na sila, hindi mo na kailangan na joint yung adoption. Allowed na kahit isa lang sa kanila ang mag-adopt because they are legally separated. Okay? So that would be the general rule. Joint adoption, exceptions yung tatlong pinag-usapan natin. One spouse seeks to adopt the legitimate child of the other. One spouse seeks to adopt his own illegitimate child, provided the other signifies his consent. And number 3, the spouses are legally separated. Okay? So, yun lang yung tatandaan ninyo for RA 8552, that is your domestic adoption law. Punta na tayo doon sa second kind of adoption in the Philippines. You have what you call your inter-country adoption. By the way, this kind of adoption is governed by Republic Act 8043, and that is your Inter-Country Adoption Act of 1995. Please do remember that this kind of adoption is considered as an adoption of last resort. Why? Kasi as a rule, no child shall be matched to a foreign adoptive family unless it is satisfactorily shown that the child cannot be adopted locally. Ibig sabihin, as a rule, pwede lang ang inter-country adoption if and only if it was found out that a Filipino child cannot be adopted here in the Philippines. Ma'am, bakit? Kasi maybe there is no family that would want to adopt the child. Or maybe walang available family na aampon dito sa batang to. So, as a last resort, we would now allow inter-country adoption. Ano ba kasing inter-country adoption? Always remember that this is a kind of adoption whereby a Filipino child is adopted by a foreigner or a Filipino citizen permanently residing abroad, and the decree of the adoption is issued outside the Philippines. I repeat, ano siya? It is a kind of adoption whereby a Filipino child may be adopted or is adopted by a foreigner or a Filipino citizen permanently residing abroad, and the decree of adoption is issued outside the Philippines. Ma'am, hindi ko gets what happened there. Dito sa inter-country adoption, sino yung subject ng adoption? You now have a Filipino child. Etong Filipino child na to, hindi siya ma-adopt locally. Walang available family in the Philippines, kaya hindi ma-apply yung domestic adoption. So, as a last resort, anong in-apply nila? Inter-country adoption. Ngayon, itong Filipino child na to would be adopted by a foreigner or maybe a Filipino citizen na permanently nakatira abroad. Now, you need to remember na yung decree of adoption or order of adoption. Okay? the order allowing the adoption of that Filipino child is not issued here in the Philippines, but rather it is issued abroad. So it was issued in a foreign country. Ano siya? It is an inter-country adoption. Now, ang isipin nyo, inter-country adoption is not really recommended kasi ang possibility, the culture of the Filipino child would now be diminished. Mawawala yung Filipino culture niya. Why? Kasi he would be growing up abroad. He would be raised most probably by a person, okay, who is no longer practicing the cultures of a Filipino. Kaya nga, as much as possible sana, we do not allow it. We only allow it as a last resort kasi no choice na tayo. Now, if you are going to look at your inter-country adoption, okay, pwedeng ang mag-adopt is who? Pwedeng ang mag-adopt niyan, or ang pwedeng mag-adopt is an alien, or maybe a Filipino citizen, tapos, both of them are permanently residing abroad. So, sino ang pwedeng mag-adopt dito? You now have an alien, or maybe you have there a Filipino citizen. Itong mga in-enumerate natin, both are permanently residing abroad. Now, tignan natin yung qualifications nung who may adopt sa inter-country adoption. Di ba may qualifications tayo for domestic adoption? Meron din tayo for inter-country adoption. Okay? Almost similar, pero may difference eh. Almost similar, pero there are still differences. Now, qualifications of a Filipino or maybe a foreigner who wants to adopt under the inter-country adoption law. Ang iisipin ninyo, the age, okay? The minimum age of the adopter should be 27 years old. I repeat, pag ang pinag-uusapan natin is inter-country adoption, what would be the age? At least 27 years old. Tapos same rule tayo sa domestic, okay? Dapat merong 16 years age gap. I repeat, sabi at least 27 years old, tapos meron tayong 16 years age gap. So, same rule tayo ha. If married, alam natin na dapat joint adoption yan. Pag married yung aampon, kailangan meron tayong joint adoption. So, yun lang naman ang iisipin ninyo dun sa who may adopt under RA 8043. So, pwedeng yung foreigner, pwedeng si Filipino citizen, basta ang kailangan, they are both permanently residing abroad. Tapos nun, at least 27 years old, and of course, merong 16 years age gap. Okay? So, ganyan ha for your inter-country adoption. By the way, guys, just points to remember about inter-country adoption tapos domestic adoption. Please do not forget na pag domestic adoption yan, ang governing body is DSWD. Pero pag inter-country adoption yan, the governing body is your Inter-Country Adoption Board or your ICAB. I repeat, pag domestic adoption, sino ang governing body? DSWD. Pag inter-country adoption, sino ang governing body? That is your Inter-Country Adoption Board. Okay? Another. Sino ba yung pwedeng ampunin? Who may be adopted? Pag domestic adoption yan, kailangan yung adoptee, yung aampunin is a child. Ibig sabihin, under 18 years old. Okay? So, sino ang pwedeng ampunin under domestic adoption? You now have a child. Ibig sabihin, under 18 years old. Tapos, yung minor na yan, yung child na yan, kailangan administratively or maybe judicially declared siya as available for adoption. I repeat ha, that minor should be declared as judicially or legally available for adoption. Kung stranger yan. Okay? Pero, pag yung bata naman is the legitimate child of your spouse, hindi na kailangan yung age requirement na yan. O di naman kaya, if yung aampunin is your own illegitimate child, again, hindi na kailangan yung age requirement. Okay? Now, pag inter-country adoption yan, mas mababa yung age requirement. Dapat yung child is below 15 years of age. Okay? At the time of the petition or application for adoption. So, anong sabi? Dapat, pag inter-country adoption, below 15. Pag domestic, below 18. Okay? So, yun ang titignan nyo ha. Tapos, under the inter-country adoption, we do not call the child as judicially or legally available for adoption. Pag ang pinag-uusapan natin is inter-country adoption, ang tawag nyo doon sa bata is legally free child. I repeat, ano siya? Legally free child. Next, you now have the venue ng filing natin ng petition for adoption. Pag domestic adoption siya, ang venue ninyo would be your family court. I repeat, pag domestic adoption, ano ang venue ng petition ninyo? That is your family court. Pero pag inter-country adoption yan, pwede siyang family court or maybe pwede siyang inter-country adoption board, yung ICAB ninyo. So, kung mapapansin nyo sa domestic adoption ninyo, yung venue ninyo is always judicial. Okay? Kasi family court yan. Pero pag inter-country yan, pwedeng administrative, pwedeng judicial kasi pwedeng yung family court, pwedeng inter-country adoption board. Okay? So, yan yung venue ng filing ng petition for adoption. Tapos, lastly, you have trial custody. Ibig sabihin, bago fully ma-adopt yung bata, meron munang trial period to determine kung magmamatch ba yung bata with the family at yung family doon sa bata. Please do remember na yung trial custody pag domestic adoption, it takes place in the Philippines. Pero pag inter-country adoption, it would take place in the country of the adoptive parents. Okay? So, yun yung differences nila. By the way, for both of them, ang trial custody would be for a period of 6 months. Okay? So, for both of them, ang iisipin nyo, the trial custody would happen for a period of 6 months. Pag inter-country yan, 6 months siya, pero possible na i-extend pa yan. So, it's possible para ma-determine talaga if the child is compatible with the, doon sa family na nagplan na ampunin siya. Okay? So, ganun siya ha. By the way, before we move on, please do remember na pag nagkaroon ng adoption, ang pwede lang mag-rescind ng adoption is the adoptee. Okay? Ibig sabihin, ang pwede lang mag-disown yung adoptee. Pwede niyang i-disown yung adoptive parents niya. Yung adoptive parents, hindi nila pwedeng i-disown yung inampon nila. So, pwede lang, sino lang ang pwedeng mag-rescind? Sino lang ang pwedeng mag-disown? Okay? Sino lang ang pwedeng mag-break ngayon nung relationship? It is only the adoptive child. It is only the adoptee. Hindi pwedeng i-cancel nung umampon. So, pag na-satisfy na or pag na-issue na yung decree of adoption, later on na-realize nila na ayoko pala, ang pwede lang ngayong cancel nung adoption na yan, ang pwede lang mag-rescind nung adoption na yan is the adoptee. Hindi pwede yung adoptive parents kasi we always protect the child. Okay? So, ganun lang siya. Those are the points that you need to remember for adoption. Ma'am, paano na ulit tayo napunta sa adoption? Kasi nga, we were talking about your child placement agency. Okay? So, let's now go to the next term. Kung may child placement agency, of course, meron din tayong child caring agency. Ma'am, ano ang child caring agency? So, always remember, bullets ulit tayo ha. We now go to your bullets, kagaya sa child placement agency. When you talk about a child caring agency, this is our next terminology. A child caring agency is, go now to the first bullet, it is a private, non-profit institution or government agency. I repeat, it is a private, non-profit institution or government agency. Anong napansin nyo? Parang child placement agency din lamang. Go now to the second one. Second bullet, anong sabi? It is duly licensed and accredited by the DSWD. Or it is, I repeat, duly licensed and accredited by the department. Okay? So, pareho pa rin sa child placement. Saan sila magkakatalo? You go now to the third bullet. Yung third bullet would be the purpose. Pag child caring agency yan, what is the purpose? Lagay nyo lang dyan, provision of 24 hours residential services. I repeat. Ano ang sabi dyan? You now have the provision of 24 hours residential services. Now, be careful ha. Hindi porke sinabi na 24 hours residential services na after 24 hours palalayasin mo na yung bata. No, 24/7 yan. As long as the child needs your help or assistance, kailangan mag-provide ka ng residential services. Kaya lang nilagay yung 24 hours residential services para ma-emphasize, okay, na round the clock yung pag-provide nila ng services doon sa bata. Ang iisipin nyo, your child caring agency does not go for adoption. Ibig sabihin, hindi sila nagfa-function for adoption purposes. Ang function lang talaga nila is to provide 24 hours residential services. If you want adoption, child placement. Okay? Pag hindi siya child placement, child caring siya. Ano sa child caring? 24 hours residential services. Okay? Now, next terminology, you have the word guardian ad litem. If you talk about guardian ad litem, it is a person appointed by the court to monitor the best interests of the child. I repeat, this is a person appointed by the court to monitor the best interests of the child. Ibig sabihin, in cases whereby, kunyari yung parents ng bata are having a conflict, we do not know kung saan dapat mapunta yung bata, or maybe merong suit dahil tong batang to is abused ng parents, habang wala pang nag-aalaga sa batang yan, dahil hindi pa possible na bumalik siya sa mga magulang niya. Mag-a-appoint ngayon yung court ng isang tao that would assure that the best interests of the child are actually provided. Anong tawag nyo dun sa appointed person na yon? You call him a guardian ad litem. The person appointed by the court to monitor the best interests of the child. Now, ma'am, ano ba kasi ang best interest of the child na yan? If you talk about best interest of the child, you need to remember that this would pertain to everything conducive or beneficial for the child. I repeat, it would pertain to the totality or everything that is beneficial to the child. So, lahat ng makakabuti dun sa batang yan, ang tawag dyan, best interest of the child. So, in case na yung parents or guardians na yan, hindi pa nila kayang i-provide yung best interest of the child dahil most probably merong pending na suit or case in court, itong court na to, mag-a-appoint siya ngayon ng guardian ad litem. Okay? So, yun lang siya. Guardian ad litem, tapos best interest of the child. Next term, you have what you call a child in conflict with the law, or yung tinatawag nyo na CICL. Before the introduction of RA 9344, or before its effectivity, we really do not call them CICLs, but rather we call them your youthful offender or maybe juvenile delinquents. Now, because our laws do not want the child to be labeled, kasi daw yung term na juvenile, yung term na youthful offender, these are forms of labels daw or stigma. E di ba sabi sa inyo, in your labeling theory, a person becomes criminal if labeled as such. So because we want to avoid cases as such, ano ang sabi? Let's change the term. Let's change the name. Instead of calling them juvenile delinquents or youthful offenders, tawagin natin sila na child in conflict with the law, or yung CICL nyo. Now, what do you mean by CICL? All you need to remember is that a CICL is a child who is alleged as, or accused of, or adjudged as having committed a crime under Philippine laws. I repeat, a CICL would refer to a child who is alleged as, accused of, or adjudged as having committed an offense under Philippine laws. Short to say, you now have a law violator. Yun nga lang, because he is a minor, okay, we provide a more friendly name and we call him a child in conflict with the law. Kaya nga diba, if the law violator is a child, you really do not call him a criminal but rather you call him a child in conflict with the law. Okay? So, yun lang siya. That is your CICL. Next. Pag-usapan natin ngayon yung tinatawag natin na age of criminal responsibility. Okay? So, age of criminal responsibility. When you talk about criminal responsibility, this would now pertain to the liability that you need to shoulder if you are going to commit a crime or a law violation. Now, dito sa slide natin, you would be able to see there a table. You have here the age and you have here the criminal responsibility. Ito, uulitin nyo siya in your book 1. Pag nag-review kayo ng book 1, pero daanan na natin siya because it's relevant in juvenile delinquency. If the person is over 70 years old, ibig sabihin lampas 70. So, ibig sabihin 70 years old and 1 day. That's over 70, hindi 71. Sabi, over 70, that is 70 years old and 1 day. If the person is over 70, ang tawag natin dyan is age of mitigated criminal responsibility. So, you already know what is meant by mitigated. Ibig sabihin yan, we now lower or maybe lessen the gravity of the crime and the penalty. Okay? Yun ang sinasabi niya. Kaya nga, if you could still remember, di ba? If the person is already over 70 years old, ito yung mga tao under the law who are not allowed to be given or to be imposed with a penalty of death. Bawal yon. Hindi mo sila pwedeng bigyan ng death penalty. Or, pwede rin naman na na-imposean sila ng death penalty, pero nag-over 70 na sila, hindi pa sila na-execute. Pag yung taong yan nag-over 70, kahit na death penalty pa ang inimpose ng court na penalty niya, etong taong to, hindi na siya pwedeng ma-execute. Okay? Pero yun nga lang, here in the Philippines, nowadays, prohibited ang imposition of death penalty. Okay? Next. 18 to 70 years old. Take note, kung titignan nyo yan, 18 is the age of emancipation or the age of majority, ha? I repeat, 18 years old is the age of emancipation or the age of majority. Ibig sabihin, you are already an adult the moment you strike 18. So, yung bracket natin, 18 to 70. So, you are an adult there. So, anong sabi? You now have the age of absolute criminal responsibility. Ibig sabihin, regardless kung baby face ka, wala akong pakialam. The moment you strike 18, all your acts now would produce legal effects. Kaya siya age of absolute or total criminal responsibility. Next, over 15 to under 18. When you say over 15, it means 15 years old and 1 day to under 18 years old. I repeat. When you say over 15 to under 18, it means 15 years old and 1 day to under 18. Ibig sabihin, 15 years old and 1 day ka, o di naman kaya, yung age mo hindi pa umaabot ng 18. Anong tawag dyan? Age of conditional criminal responsibility. I repeat, it is the age of conditional criminal responsibility. Why conditional? Kasi ang criminal responsibility would be conditioned on the fact that did you act with discernment or did you act without discernment. Okay? So, ganun siya. By the way, bago ko makalimutan, kung kunyari nag-birthday ako ngayon, I turned 15. Kasama ba ako dito sa age of conditional criminal responsibility? The answer is no. Kailan ako kasama dyan? Bukas. Okay? Kasi 15 years old and 1 day. Okay? Now, sa age of conditional criminal responsibility, we are not yet sure if you are criminally liable or not. Ma'am, bakit? Kasi I still need to determine, did you act with discernment or without discernment? Now, ganito. If the child who is over 15 to under 18 acted with discernment, anong i-undergo niya? He would undergo diversion. Okay? Always remember that diversion is the suspension of juvenile proceedings. I repeat, when you talk about diversion, it is the suspension of juvenile proceedings. Or, you can also call it as an alternative to juvenile proceedings. So diversion is what? It is the suspension of juvenile proceedings or an alternative to juvenile proceedings. Why call it suspension of juvenile proceedings? Kasi possible na meron nang na-file na case against the child. Pero because he's over 15 to under 18, although he acted with discernment, yung na-file na case masususpend muna to allow a diversion. Or maybe, wala pang na-file na case against that minor. So, bago ka dumiretso daw sa filing ng juvenile proceedings ops, try muna natin na mag-diversion. Kaya siya alternative. So, pwede siyang alternative or maybe suspension of juvenile proceedings. If the child acted with discernment, he would undergo diversion. If the diversion fails, pag nag-fail ang diversion, what would happen? We would now allow the continuation or maybe the filing of juvenile proceedings. I repeat. If the child over 15 to under 18 acted with discernment, what would happen? We would allow him to undergo diversion. If the diversion fails, what would happen? Magkakaroon ng continuation or maybe magkakaroon ng filing of juvenile proceedings. Dahil may na-file na juvenile proceedings, ang possibility ma-acquit or ma-convict yung bata. The moment that minor is convicted by the court, what would happen? He would be criminally liable. Yun nga lang because he is a minor. Itong over 15 to under 18 who acted with discernment and his diversion failed was later on convicted, di ba? What would be the effect now or the impact of his age? His age now would be treated as a privileged mitigating circumstance. And because it is a privileged mitigating circumstance, what's the effect now? The penalty imposed by the court would be lowered by 1 degree. So take for instance, merong bata, he was 17 years old, he killed someone. Nag-diversion siya kasi he acted with discernment. So nag-diversion siya pero yung diversion nag-fail dahil paliwawang yung bata, pasaway yung batang yan. So what happened? Nag-file sila ng juvenile proceedings na convict siya. So he was now given the penalty of, kunyari, he was given reclusion temporal. Now, dahil minor siya and he acted with discernment, may privilege mitigating circumstance of minority. Yung minority na yan would now be used in order to lower reclusion temporal down to prison major. Okay? So, ganun siya. Next. If the child acted without discernment, okay? Anong sabi? He would undergo what you call an intervention. Pag intervention dyan, what you do is to determine what went wrong. What are the problems of the child? The child is not really an offender but rather also a victim in this situation. Yun ang presumption under intervention. So if the child is over 15 to under 18 and he acted without discernment, ano lang i-undergo niya? Intervention. Ma'am, what if the intervention fails? Give him another intervention. Basta ang presumption ng law, intervention would work because he acted without discernment. Now, ma'am, ano ba kasi ang discernment na sinasabi mo? Please do remember that discernment is the mental capacity to know what is right from what is wrong. I repeat, it is the mental capacity to know what is right from what is wrong. Ibig sabihin, if you know that what you did is wrong, you acted with discernment. If you do not understand that it's wrong, you acted without discernment. Example, you are 16 kunyari. Tapos nun, meron kang pinatay or maybe may binugbog ka. Tapos nagtago ka. Question, bakit ka nagtago? Kasi alam mo na you did something wrong. Thereby, dun mo makita ay he acted with discernment. Okay? Next. 15 and below. Okay? By the way, before we go to 15 and below, pag yung bata is over 15 to under 18 and he acted without discernment, minority here is considered as an exempting circumstance. If you say exempting circumstance, ibig sabihin, the child would not be criminally liable. There is no criminal liability, but there is civil liability to be borne by the parents or the guardian of the child. Okay? Ganyan ang rule natin ha, if the child acted without discernment. It would be considered as an exempting circumstance. No criminal liability, but with civil liability to be borne by the parents or guardians of the child. So, next, you have their 15 and below. So, pag 15, eksakto yan, birthday ko ngayon, 15 ako ngayon, kasama pa ako dito sa bracket na to. 15 and below, you call that the age of absolute criminal irresponsibility. Ma'am, ba't siya tinawag na age of absolute criminal irresponsibility? Kasi, ito yung age kung saan I don't really care if you act with or without discernment. Okay? Ang determination ng discernment, important lang pag over 15 to under 18. Kasi conditional criminal responsibility. Pag 15 and below, you now have absolute criminal irresponsibility. Ibig sabihin, whether you acted with or without discernment, there is no criminal liability. Why? Kasi 15 and below, in this case, minority is also an exempting circumstance. So, dahil exempting circumstance siya, ibig sabihin, the child has no criminal liability. Okay? But there is civil liability to be borne by the parents or the guardian. Okay? So, yun lang siya. So, you need to look, ano bang criminal responsibility yung pinag-uusapan natin? Mitigated ba? Absolute ba? Conditional ba? Or irresponsibility ba? Ano ba? So, you need to determine it for you to know anong age yung pinag-uusapan natin. Now, saan tayo nagkaka-problem? In the board examination, madalas ang sinasabi lang, what is the age of criminal responsibility? Now, be very careful. Ang common error ng mga crime, ang sagot nila is 18. That's wrong. Okay? Hindi naman sinabing absolute criminal responsibility eh. Ang sabi, what is the age of criminal responsibility? Ang iisipin nyo if that's the question, dahil hindi quinalify kung anong criminal responsibility, pupunta kayo doon sa age na merong possibility na magkaroon ng criminal responsibility. So, at what age is it possible na magkaroon ng criminal responsibility? It starts at over 15 to under 18 with discernment. Okay? So, pag ang tanong lang ha, what is the age of criminal responsibility? Huwag kang sasagot ng 18 kasi hindi sinabing absolute. So, dahil very generic yung tanong, ang isasagot nyo dyan, age of criminal responsibility is over 15 to under 18 with discernment. Okay? Kasi yan yung minimum age kung saan possible na ang criminal responsibility. Okay? So, that's it for your age of criminal responsibility. So, next, restorative justice. Please do remember, pag restorative justice, you memorize the acronym VOC, Victim Offender Community. So, VOC, Victim Offender Community. Ang isipin lang ninyo, restorative justice is a process of resolving disputes with the maximum participation of the victim, the offender, and the community. I repeat, pag restorative justice, it is a process of resolving disputes with the maximum participation of the victim, the offender, and the community. In here, what would you notice? We do not allow the government to be involved. Kasi daw, if you allow the government to be involved, what would happen? Mas lalala daw yung dispute kasi nga, meron at merong incarceration dyan, meron at merong trial dyan. So that's something that we are trying to avoid in restorative justice. Of course, pag batang involved, hanggat maaari, we do not want the issue to be aggravated. Kaya we now try to settle everything within the community. By the way, ang restorative justice ninyo is very evident in your KP, Katarungang Pambarangay, di ba? Sabi sa inyo, if the imposable penalty for the crime committed is 1 year and below, hindi ka agad pwedeng mag-file in court. You need to settle it within the barangay level. Restorative justice din yun. Okay? We would not talk about it that much kasi nga, itatakal nyo rin siya in another CrimSoc subject. Okay? So, I'll just leave it there. Basta remember, pag minors yan, we want restorative justice. Why? Victim offender community. In order to avoid the aggravation of the issue or the case. Okay? So, next, you have what you call a youth detention center. Ganito. Under PD 603, you call it a youth detention center. Under RA 9344, you call it a youth detention home. Pero pag RA 10630, you call it your bahay pag-asa. I repeat. Under PD 603, you have there a youth detention center. Under RA 9344, you call it a youth detention home. Pero under the so-called RA 10630, ang tawag na dyan would be bahay pag-asa. Ang iisipin nyo, youth detention center man yan, youth detention home, or bahay pag-asa, pare-pareho lang yan. All of them are considered as child caring agencies. Yun nga lang, this child caring agency would be providing a 24-hour residential services to CICLs who are awaiting court disposition or may be transferred to other agencies or jurisdiction. I repeat. Pag sinabi nyo na youth detention center, youth detention home, or maybe bahay pag-asa, always remember that it is a child caring agency or institution which provides 24 hours residential services to CICLs who are awaiting court disposition or maybe awaiting transfer to other agencies or maybe jurisdictions. Okay? That is your youth detention center, youth detention home, or maybe bahay pag-asa. Ang titignan nyo lang dyan kung anong law ang pinag-uusapan kasi magkakaroon ng variation sa tawag although they mean the same thing. Pag hindi na-provide yung law, ang presumption, present law. So, pag present law yan, you use the term bahay pag-asa. Okay? Please be very, very careful kasi ang youth detention center is not the same with the youth rehabilitation center. Pag youth rehabilitation center yan, ibig sabihin, there was already a decision regarding the case of the CICL. Okay? So, there was already a decision and this youth rehabilitation center now would be providing rehabilitation services. Ang isipin nyo, child caring agency din lamang ang youth rehabilitation center. Yun nga lang, its primary purpose would be rehabilitation and treatment. Okay? So, ganun lang siya. That is your youth rehabilitation center in contrast with the youth detention center. Let's talk about the word juvenile. By the way, ang etymology ng salitang juvenile is the Latin word juvenis. When you say juvenis, it means a young person. Okay? I repeat, when you talk about juvenis, na origin ng salitang juvenile, it means a young person. Yung juvenis na yan, it was later on converted into the term juvenilis. When you say juvenilis, same. It talks about a young person. Okay? So, juvenile etymology, pwede siyang juvenis or maybe juvenilis, which means a young person. Now, based on that, pag-usapan natin yung definition ng law of who a juvenile is. Please do remember that he is a child or a young person who, under the legal system, may be dealt with in a manner different from an adult. I repeat, he is a child or a young person who, under the legal system, may be dealt with in a manner different from that of an adult. Ibig sabihin, if you are a juvenile, we are not saying that you have already committed a crime. Ang sinasabi natin, if you are a juvenile, you are a child or maybe a young person. And in case, in the future you would be committing a crime, you may be placed under the legal system. Yun nga lang, because you are a child, ang treatment sa'yo is different from that of an adult. Yes, you may be placed in the legal system, but you are going to be treated in a manner different from that of an adult. Kaya nga, diba, if you would notice it, pag minor yan, pwede mo ba siyang ilagay sa jail o kaya sa prison? Definitely the answer is no. because juveniles are treated differently from adults. Okay? So, ganun lang siya. Next, you have here child at risk. Pag sinabi niyong child at risk, this refers to a child who is vulnerable to and at risk of crime commission because of social and family or personal circumstances. I repeat, this refers to a child who is vulnerable to and at risk of crime commission because of social, family, or personal circumstances. Ibig sabihin, kaya siya tinawag na child at risk kasi there is a high tendency that this person would commit a crime. Why? Kasi meron siyang social, personal, or maybe family problems. Okay? Ang child at risk ninyo had not yet committed any crime. He had not yet committed any crime, ha? Hindi pa siya gumagawa ng crime. Yun nga lang, there is a high possibility na gagawa siya ng crime kasi nga hindi okay ang personal, family, or maybe social circumstances niya. Okay? So, take for instance, pag yung bata is abused, okay? If you could still remember, the abused becomes the abuser. Pag yung bata, abused siya kunyari, there is a high risk or a high tendency that this child would later on commit a crime because of that social circumstance or maybe because of that family circumstance. Okay? Child at risk. Ibig sabihin, yes, he had not yet committed any crime pero there is a high possibility that this child might commit a crime soon. Okay? That is your child at risk. Juvenile delinquency refers to a large number of disapproved behaviors of children. I repeat, it refers to a large number of disapproved behaviors of children. Ibig sabihin, these are behaviors of children which are not socially accepted. Mga gawaing bata na hindi katanggap-tanggap sa society. Take note, ang juvenile delinquency does not necessarily require a law violation. It is enough that a child did something and his actions were not socially acceptable. Kaya nga, ang juvenile delinquency, pwede siyang crime, pwede siyang status offense. Okay? You already know that if the behavior of the child is violative of the law, that kind of juvenile delinquency is considered as a crime. Pero, if the juvenile delinquency does not violate any law pero socially unaccepted siya, it might only fall as a status offense. When you say status offenses, these are acts which, if committed by adults, are acceptable but are wrong if committed by children. I repeat, these are acts which, if committed by adults, are acceptable but are wrong if committed by children. Ibig sabihin, if adult ang gumawa, it's okay. Pero pag minor ang gumawa, it's not okay. Example, if an adult would be reading a pornographic material or maybe even adult would be drinking liquor, okay lang yun, di ba? Pero pag bata ang gumawa niyan, ops, hindi siya katanggap-tanggap. So you call it a status offense. If you're going to look at it, juvenile delinquency siya, pero there is really no law violation. Okay? Kaya nga I told you a while back, ang juvenile delinquency can be a crime or maybe a mere status offense. Pag status offense, okay lang pag jutanders ang gumawa, pero hindi okay pag minor. Now, ano yung mga sikat na status offenses natin? You now have what you call your school through 1C. When you say school through 1C, ibig sabihin, these are unjustified absences. So, school through 1C would be what? Unjustified absences. Tapos, pag school tardiness naman, it talks about being late. So, school tardiness, it talks about being late. Okay? Ano pa yung mga status offenses ninyo? Running away from home, reading pornographic material, you have their smoking, drinking liquor, yung mga ganun. Okay? Status offenses. Next, you have here the term dolly incapax. When you hear the word dolly incapax, it means not capable of criminal intent. I repeat, dolly incapax, not capable of criminal intent. Ang isipin nyo lang dito, under your neoclassical theory, there is a presumption that a child is not capable of criminal intent because they cannot calculate pleasure or maybe pain. Hindi nila naiintindihan yan. Kaya nga ang presumption, if the person who committed a violation is a child, ang presumption natin, they are not capable of criminal intent. Yun ang reason kung bakit, generally speaking, pag child ang gumawa ng crime, okay, exempted sila. Unless they acted with discernment. Okay? So yun ha, Dolly, incapax. Not capable of criminal intent. Next, we now have the following terms. You have their jus vitae agnesis, patria potestas, in loco parentis, and parens patriae. Let's start with jus vitae agnesis. When you hear this term, always remember that jus vitae agnesis means power over life and death. So, jus vitae agnesis, power over life and death. Now, anong sabi nito? This concept is negative. Why? Kasi it purely talks about the authority of the parents over the life of the child. Kaya nga before, pag hindi gusto ng parents na mabuhay yung bata, kahit na ipanganak pa yan or what, the life of the child would always depend on the parents. If they want the child to die, it's okay. It's up to them. Yun yung jus vitae agnesis. Kaya nga, because this concept is highly negative, inintroduce ngayon yung patria potestas. It is actually a modification of your jus vitae agnesis. When you say patria potestas, it is your right and responsibility over the person and property of the child. I repeat. Patria potestas is your parental authority. Mama, ano yung parental authority? Ano yung patria potestas? It is your right and responsibility over the person and property of the child. Ibig sabihin, dito sa patria potestas, we now recognize the idea na for every right, there is always a responsibility. Kumbaga ba, yes, I have the right na pakialaman yung affairs mo. Pero at the same time, as I do that, I need to make sure that I am doing it for your own good. That is your patria potestas. Now, when you say patria potestas, ang iisipin nyo ha, ang Philippines embodies an egalitarian system. When you say egalitarian system, ibig sabihin, the father and the mother are co-equals. I repeat, in an egalitarian system, the father and the mother are co-equals. So because of that, okay, etong civil code natin, na dati ang sinasabi, parental authority is only exercised by the father, pinalitan yun. Yung provisions ng civil code about parental authority, pinalitan siya under the family code. Kasi yung civil code is more of a patriarchal system. It's father-dominated. By the introduction of the family code, we embody the egalitarian system. So, anong sabi? Under your family code, lagi tayong merong tinatawag na joint parental authority. Anong sabi? Parental authority is jointly exercised by both the father and the mother. Now, ang general rule, joint parental authority, father and mother, both exercise parental authority. Exception, in case of conflict. So, exception, in case of conflict. In case of conflict between the father and the mother, take note, the father's decision shall prevail. In case of conflict, whose decision would prevail? The father's decision would prevail. Kaya nga matatawa ka eh. Imagine, sabi mo egalitarian system, jointly exercised ang parental authority. Pero the moment na mag-away sila in case of conflict sa parental authority, whose authority would be followed? That would be the father's decision, unless there is a court order. I repeat, unless there is a court order. Now, okay, patria potestas. Rule, joint parental authority kasi ang family code embodies an egalitarian system. Father and mother are co-equals, that's why father and mother would both exercise parental authority over their child. Yun nga lang, as an exception, in case of conflict, the father's decision shall prevail unless there's a court order or a court decision. So pag nag-away yung mga magulang mo in terms of parental authority, laging yung tatay ang masusunod. Unless nag-issue ngayon yung court ng order saying otherwise. Unless nag-issue yung court ng order na, oops, hindi si father ang masusunod, si mother ang masusunod, or si ganito yung masusunod. Okay? That is for your patria potestas. Pero take note, yung joint parental authority na yan, ine-exercise lang yan if the child is a legitimate child. Kung hindi legitimate child yung batang yan, kung illegitimate siya, ibig sabihin the child was born out of wedlock. The parental authority shall be exercised by the mother. Okay? Sino mag-exercise ng parental authority pag illegitimate child, yung pinag-uusapan natin? The parental authority over the illegitimate child is always exercised by the mother. Okay? So, yun ang rule natin. That is your patria potestas, parental authority. By the way, under your parental authority, meron tayong tinatawag na parental custody. Ibig sabihin, the child would be staying with whom? Okay? That is your parental custody. Kanino magstay yung bata? Of course, if the parents are married, okay, if the parents are married, tapos nun meron silang legitimate child, ang parental custody would be, okay, with both parents. Joint din siya, joint parental custody. That's the general rule. Kaya lang, in case of conflict or in case of separation, what would happen? Ang sabi nila, yung parental custody would be dependent on the age of the child. If the child is 7 years old and above, I repeat, if the child is 7 years old and above, kanino ang parental custody? The parental custody goes to the chosen parent. Okay, I repeat, parental custody goes to the chosen parent unless, okay, unless the chosen parent is unfit. I repeat, pag hindi okay yung mga magulang nung bata, kanino mapupunta ang custody? Tignan yung age. If the child is 7 years old and above, the custody now would go to the chosen parent. Sino yung pinili niya? Unless the chosen parent is unfit. So, kanino siya mapupunta? Dun sa chosen parent niya unless yung pinili niyang parent unfit siya. So, halimbawa, ang pinili niya is yung nanay or ang pinili niya is yung tatay, pero hindi naman pala siya kayang buhayin. So, kahit na yun ang pinili niyang parent, unfit yung napili niyang parent, so what would happen? He would be given to the other parent, kahit hindi yun yung parent na pinili niya. But, if the child is under 7, so wala pang 7 years old yung bata, under 7 siya, parental custody shall go to the mother, unless there are compelling reasons. I repeat, pag yung bata is under 7, parental custody goes to the mother, unless there are compelling reasons. Take note ha, compelling reasons yung sinabi. Ibig sabihin, dapat mabigat yung reason. So example, insane yung mother o di naman kaya she's suffering from a communicable disease or maybe abusive siya. Ang isipin nyo sa board exam, ang laging binibigay doon, the mother is a prostitute. Ang isipin nyo, if the mother is a prostitute, hindi siya compelling reason. Ibig sabihin, pag yung bata is under 7 years old, pwede siyang mapunta sa nanay niya kahit na prostitute yung nanay niya because prostitution is not a compelling reason. Okay? So, ganun lang siya. Guys, we are talking about parental custody of legitimate children, adopted children, and legitimated children. Pag illegitimate yan, laging mother. Okay? Parental authority, parental custody, mother yan. Pag illegitimate child. Okay? So, ganun lang siya. That would be your patria potestas. When you say in loco parentis, pumapasok lang to if the parents are no longer available or can no longer exercise parental authority. So what is in loco parentis? This is your substitute parental authority. Anong sabi dito? In the absence of the parents, the following may exercise in loco parentis. Pero titignan nyo, itong list na to would be successive. Ibig sabihin, you start with letter A, in the absence of A, go to B, in the absence of B, you go to C. Okay? So, ano ang sabi? Sino ang mag-exercise ng substitute parental authority? Number 1, surviving grandparents. Hindi kailangang maternal, hindi kailangang paternal. Basta surviving grandparents who are able and are willing to provide the best interests of the child. So, hindi kailangang sobrang yaman. It is enough that these grandparents now can provide the best interests of the child. Pero, in their absence, you now go to the older sibling, at least 21 years old. Si ate or si kuya na at least 21 years old. Pag hindi pa rin sila available, you now go to the third one. You have the actual custodian. Yan yung actual na guardian who again is at least 21 years old. Now, in case wala nang ang parents or maybe in case wala makapag-exercise ng substitute parental authority, punta kayo sa parents patriae. Ang isipin lang ninyo, sabi ng parents patriae, the state acts as the parents of the weak, and the weak now shall include yung tinatawag natin na child. Kaya nga, kung juvenile ang subject ninyo, ang definition lang ng parents patriae is the state acts as a parent of the child. So, the state acts as a parent of the child, kung Juvi. Pero yung definition niya talaga, the state acts as the parent or maybe the protector of citizens who cannot protect themselves. Ibig sabihin, citizens who are considered as weak. Okay? Dito nyo na ipapasok sina dependent child. Dito na papasok sina voluntary and involuntary committed child. Okay? Doon yung makikita na in cases whereby hindi na naproprovidean yung bata, sino magproprovide for them? That would be the state. That is under your parents' patriae. Now, okay? Punta na tayo sa family, home, tapos house. Okay? I-define lang natin sila. Itong tatlong terms na to, they are not the same. Pero ang problem, most often than not, na pagpapalit-palit sila. So, i-define natin sila. Okay? Always remember, a family is considered as a group of people composed of the father, the mother, their children, and at times, their relatives. I repeat. It is a group of people composed of the father, the mother, their children, and at times, their relatives. That's a family. Nanay, tatay, mga Jonakis nila, tapos, at times, yung mga relatives nila. Pag family ang pinag-uusapan, pwede siyang nuclear family, pwede siyang extended family, or maybe, pwede rin siyang blended family. When you say nuclear family, always remember father, mother, and their children. Pag extended family, father, mother, their children, relatives. Extended yun. Pag sinabing blended, you now have a combination of two different families in one. Ibig sabihin, kunyari, si father may mga anak. Si mother may mga anak. Okay? Ngayon, itong father and mother na to, hindi sila yung kasal. Or maybe, hindi sila yung original partners. Tapos itong two different families na to, pagsasamahin mo sila, or they would join each other to form one family. That is your blended family. Example, si Maria, anak niya si Juan. Si Pedro, anak niya si Kulasa. Si Maria, kasal siya dati sa iba, tapos itong si Pedro, kasal siya dati sa iba. Ngayon, hindi nag-work out yung mga marriages nila, and then, nagkahiwalay sila. Ngayon, itong si Maria, tapos itong si Pedro, Nag-meet sila later on, tapos nun, nagkagustuhan sila, pagsasamahin nila yung families nila, that's a blended family. On the other hand, pag sinabi niyong home, always remember that it is a family sharing love and affection. I repeat, it is a family sharing love and affection. So, pag yung family na yan, nagsishare ng love and affection, ano siya? You call it a home. All homes are considered as families. Pero not all families are considered as homes. Lahat ng home family. Yun nga lang, they share love and affection. Hindi lahat ng family home kasi hindi naman lahat ng family would be sharing love and affection. Pag sinabi nyo naman na house talks about the structure or maybe the building or maybe the installation where a person or a family lives. It is the building, the structure, or the installation where a family lives. Okay? So, yun siya. That is your family, that is your home, that is your house. Okay? Now, based on that, pupunta na tayo dun sa next na topic. So, dito yung end ng terminologies natin. Okay? So, let's now proceed to the next topic.